1, 2, 3, 4. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Yeah, Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour.
Welcome to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. I'm excited to have my friend and mentor, Buzz Cason, back on the program today. He was my very first guest when I launched the podcast, and we talked about his whole career, but there's so many more stories that I wanted to capture here, and Buzz agreed to be back on the show, and today we'll focus on his songwriting and some of the recordings that might not be as well known to the public. So let's go down that rabbit hole. Thanks for being on my show again, Buzz.
Oh, it's great to be here, Andreas, being back on the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. And I know you've had some outstanding guests in the recent months, and I'm glad to be a part of it. And just so thankful for you having this to reveal some of these stories and bibliography or record discographies or whatever to folks that may not know about them,
Yeah, that's important to me too, to make sure that history doesn't get lost, because there's a lot of information out there, and sometimes it's hard to find it. And if I can contribute a little bit to that, I'll be happy to. So let's go back to you starting to write songs. I remember you told me that when you met Bobby Russell and he asked you if you were a songwriter, you answered yes. And by that time, you'd written like half of a song.
Yeah, that's right.
So why don't we start there?
Yes, the first song that I probably completed to maybe possibly get recorded. I may have had just a few that I was fooling around with, but I was in a band called the Casuals, and Richard Williams was my co-singing partner, and Noel Ball, the DJ that kind of had taken us under his wing, asked us to record for him, and we were to sneak into the WSIX AM studios late one night after everything had finished on broadcasting and record a record. So we needed some songs. So he said, "You guys write some songs, whatever you come up with, we'll record." So I was still living at home out on RD Avenue. I was 17 and, actually 16 when we wrote the song. Oh, and I had Richard come out to the house. I had an old upright piano, and we wrote this song called "My Love Song for You." It was kind of a C to A minor, F to G, what they call nowadays a doo-wop kind of a ballad. And we took that and a B-side. We had a B-side called "Help Me," which was kind of a blues thing on the B-side. And we took the Casuals down to WSX Studios and recorded it. I remember, I don't even think we had a bass on "My Love Song for You." We may have had one on the B-side for some reason, but anyway, we recorded it, and it came out on a little label called New Sound, which was a label that Noel had started with Buzz Wilburn, who Buzz's brother was another Wilburn, his name's slipping my mind right now, who was an engineer that became pretty well known in Nashville. But they asked me to do a label, so I drew out. I was an amateur artist, and I did the label for the record company. And I guess "My Love Song for You" was the first song out on it. And Noel Ball managed to get Randy Wood to pick it up for Dot Records because he was involved with good friends with Randy and had played all the Pat Boone records, and he was, I don't know whether he was on Randy's payroll or what, but he had a real strong connection with him, and he got it released nationally on Dot. So that was my first delve into songwriting, and then, as you mentioned, later on, that was in '56, and '57's when the record came out, and along about '58, '59, I met Bobby Russell down at Globe Studios, and that's when he asked me the question, do you write songs? So Bobby asked me, he said, do you write? And I said, yeah, I'd written one half of one song, so I figured I qualified to be a writer, and he was kind of halfway signed to Gary Walker for Lowry Music. Gary was representing Lowry up here from Atlanta, and so he said, "Look, come out to my house." We went out to his house out on Sperry Road, out in the Green Hills area, and we proceeded to write Tennessee, which we went in to record it, and Gary said, "Well, let's make a record out of it." So we had Bergen White had come into the fold. He was a student still over at Belmont, and we had I don't know whether we had Eddie Studeville on guitar or what. I cannot recall the musicians, but we recorded this song Tennessee, which was a pa-pa-pa-pa-pa kind of a song, and Gary got it to Paul Cohen, who was at Todd Records, which Todd was named after his son. He had, you may recall, was the first producer in Nashville for Decca Records, and Owen Bradley had more or less replaced him, so he went on his own and formed this small label, and he put it out under the name of the Todds, and it was a pretty good little record for its day. And then Gary moved on and got in touch with either Lou Adler or Snuff Garrett. They were co-producing this session on Jan and Dean. And Jan and Dean had Baby Talk, which was another ba-ba-ba-ba kind of a record. And they flipped over Tennessee and put it out, and it got in the charts. So Bobby and I thought, man, this is easy. Our first song's a hit, you know. I mean, it wasn't really that big a hit, but it got in the charts, in the Billboard charts. And later on, we would write Popsicle together, which would not come out for a few years, but Popsicle got in top 20. It was a pretty good hit for him, and it followed the same path. We did it as the Todds, and then Gary got it covered by Jan and Dean. So we were kind of on our way there, writing and just coming up with songs along the way, and we had a kind of a little partnership with Tony Moon for a while called Tri-Arch Productions. We thought we were going to be a production company. We had no money and no artists or anything, but we produced a few little things along the way. And but in the meantime, we had several names of we would do fictitious groups. Like we'd had Tony and I wrote one called Watermelon, which we put out under the name of the Countdowns, and we had some other ones that came along the way too. And I brought along some of the 45 from way back in those years when we were, doing just random records, because you could do a 45 and get it out pretty quick, and you didn't have to worry about an album unless you had a hit or maybe two hits before you got an album. So Tony and I wrote some together, and then along in '62 we wrote Soldier of Love, or Lay Down Your Arms as it came out for originally, and Arthur Alexander recorded that, because once again Noel Ball came into the picture, and he produced that record. And he said, if you guys will write something for Arthur, I'll record it. He had a great network voice. And so it was one of those rare instances where you write something for an artist and they actually cut it. Of course, that song has gone on to have a little life of its own, being covered by the likes of the Beatles and Pearl Jam and the Derailers, and
Marshall Crenshaw.
Marshall Crenshaw did a nice version of it. But it was just a joy going into the studio and just experimenting around. And these guys, Kenny Marlowe, who became Bobby and I, my attorney for several years, and then Gary went on to work for various publishing companies. And Gary Walker's still active in his 80s. He has the Great Escape record stores, and still piddles with some production on things. And he's quite a man. I owe a whole lot to him. He encouraged Bobby and I when we were just struggling, just kind of throwing darts in the dark, and he had confidence in us. But we had several little pseudonyms along the way, and I'm rambling through these 45s even as we speak to try to come up with a couple that were like that. I moved to California in '62, and Carol Connors would come around the studio around Liberty Records where I worked, and she had written "Hey Little Cobra," and had received a Mustang for writing it, a complimentary Mustang, which I got to drive down through the alleys of Hollywood. And she always had something going, and I'm pulling out a song now. This is from '62, called "Sammy the Sidewalk Surfer," and some way or another, Screen Gems became the publisher on this. It's by the Surfettes. It was a girls group on the Mustang record label, still capitalizing on the Ford muscle car thing, and so that was one of them that we put out. That was a girls group, though. That wasn't me under another name, although I sang a lot of high parts along the way.
Yeah.
And
around the same time, you also became Gary Miles, didn't you?
Well, yeah, Gary happened before that. Happened in 1960, and he was a 6-month star. That was when we covered the name Gary Mills, who was the original singer in the movie Circus of Horrors, and it probably is one of the only times it ever happened that someone covered the song and the name of the record, and we did a couple of other Gary Miles records, but they weren't ever anything that I wrote. It was Snuff Garrett would pull a song out from New York or something, and we would go in and record that. But I, of course, wrote some for the Crickets. When I moved to L.A., Snuff gave me the Crickets and Buddy Knox to record. And I brought Buddy back to Nashville, and we recorded "Thanks a Lot," which was an old Ernest Stubb record, and which I didn't write. But then he gave me the Crickets, and our first record we did was "Lonely Avenue," which I also didn't write. Of course, that was a Ray Charles song.
Yeah, and I think that's a Doc Pomus composition.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it is. And we long about '64, we recorded a version of La Bamba that Jerry Allison and I wrote to the tune of La Bamba, and Leon Russell worked on the record with us, arranged the horns and played piano on it, and then we also, prior to that, went to Clovis. Jerry wanted to take one more trip to Clovis and record with Norman Petty. Of course, when we went down there, we knew we would have to give him the publishing, which was a bizarre demand on Norman's part, but that's the way he did business. So we just said, well, the heck with it. We'll do it just for the fun of it. We wrote You Can't Be In Between, and there's a couple of other songs that Jerry Allison and I wrote for that project. But La Bamba managed to make it up pretty high in the charts in England, and I had replaced Jerry Naylor in the Crickets as lead singer. And we had a great tour of England in '64. We did about 30 dates, and one right after the other, and played Royal Albert Hall and played the Wimbledon Palais. We played a lot of, but mainly it was small venues and some theaters, but it was a fun trip. And,
wasn't John Lee Hooker on some of those shows too?
Well, we were on Ready, Steady, Go, which was the big TV show, and John Lee was on that show along with Dusty Springfield, the Swingin' Blue Jeans, and the Animals were also all on that TV show. And that was where you played live. You played one song live, and we did La Bamba, and Jerry Allison sang lead on La Bamba, so he picked up the acoustic, and I sat on the drums and kind of just flogged away. And right when they introduced us, the power went out, so Sonny Curtis was playing guitar on it, and Glenn D. Hardin was playing a bass with the left hand on a Fender keyboard bass, and a little electric piano on the right hand, and all that went out, and it was nothing but me and J.I. for about 8 bars there, just playing with an acoustic and drums. But that was quite a TV show. That was really an experience. And we came back to L.A., and then I moved back in later on in late '64. I moved back to Nashville, and that's when Bobby Russell and I got serious about starting our publishing company, and we got in with Fred Foster, and that's along about the time of '67. Mac Gaden and I wrote Everlasting Love, which came out on the Rising Suns label, which was a subsidiary of Monument that Fred had formed with Bobby and I and his partner Jack Kirby. And we had limited success with Robert. We had the one song, he was really kind of a one-hit wonder, but I brought along a copy of My Rainbow Valley, which came out after Everlasting Love. Now, some of you may know that Everlasting Love was covered in England by The Love Affair on CBS Records, and Peter Phillips, our publisher over there, got that cover, and we wish he had just gotten Robert's released and we'd had the hit with Robert, but as it turned out, it went #1 with The Love Affair, and then the follow-up, Rainbow Valley, went real high. It may have even gone #1, but once again, the Rainbow Valley didn't hit with Robert, but it hit with The Love Affair, and we proceeded on to make a few more records with Robert. But in the meantime, and a few years prior to that, we cut under some oddball names and did a record with the Hollywood Argyles called Bossy Nova, which it was called My Real Boss Bossy Nova. It was produced by Papa Don Schroeder, written by me, and I have no idea how it went. Featuring the Hollywood Argyles, featuring Speedy Gonzalez and the Tijuana Lead, whatever that meant. And then here's another one that was, interestingly enough, the orchestra was conducted by Jerry Kennedy, the great producer from Mercury Records. But it was Lonely Birthday, written by myself and Bobby Russell, by Shirley May, and produced by Jack Tracy, who I can't remember. In fact, I played this at home a while ago, and I couldn't remember the song. There was another small label that used to record here at the studio called Caprice Records, and it was owned by Don Lewis, who who had a kind of a custom label. He would record people coming in that paid him to record them and all of that stuff. And this particular piece of vinyl here is like on red vinyl. It's called Texas, and it was another flop record. But
and then the B-side is Heavy Dudes and Heartaches, that is credited to you and Jimmy Buffett.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Heavy Dudes and Heartaches was the B-side, yeah. Buffett and I had started writing together in 70 on the High Cumberland Jubilee project. It was done right here in this studio we're sitting in. And we wrote Coming Down Slow, God Don't Own a Car, England, several songs on that
Bend a Little is one of my favorites.
Which one?
Bend a Little?
Yeah, Bend a Little was a good one, yeah. And we had fun doing that.
You mentioned Papa Don Schroeder a little earlier. He eventually came up here and did a cover of Everlasting Love on Carl Carlton here
in this studio. Yes,
and you sang on that too, didn't you?
Yeah, I got to sing the high voice parts on that and Robert Knight's record, and that was quite a treat. Yeah, the Carl Carlton was a million seller, and I just found another one by my old good friend Johnny McCrae, who was Bob Beckham's right-hand man in plugging songs down on the row, and he was at the time was in with Gary Paxton, and they cut a song of mine called Tag Along, and they would cut a single a week. They would cut, that was on the Felstead label, which I don't know if you ever heard of that or not.
No, I have not.
Felstead had some hits, and
but that Hollywood Argyle's record was on Felstead as well.
Yes, that was Hollywood Argyle's, of course, had Alley Oop earlier in about 1960.
Yeah.
And but moving along, we're kind of taking the back side of things on into the 70s. Bucky Wilkin and I, who in '66 had a hit on Sandy, we co-wrote, and we wrote several songs on the Sandy album, and then later we did a experimental record. It went up on Warner Brothers. He was friends with Dick Glaser, as I was. I had worked with Dick Glaser at Liberty Records. He was a producer there, and we cut a record under the name of the Eagles. We were the first Eagles, and the Ballad to a Lady was, I believe, considered the A-side. It was a patriotic song. In the end, it had the acrostic AMERICA, and may each I can't think how it was. It went anyway. It spelled out America, whatever the acrostic was for it. We did a couple of records on Robert Knight around that time, 67. One that I just picked up here is called Smokey, written by Matt Gaden and I. It was a classic little song, and the B-side was If I Had My Way. That was one that, and we did Isn't It Lonely Together, which Ray Stevens wrote. We did that for Elf.
Yeah,
Records.
So we mentioned Rising Suns before, and there's quite a few 45s that came out on the Rising Suns, and then you had Elf. Who were your partners in Elf?
That was just Bobby Russell and I, and we were distributed by Amy Malabelle out of New York, Larry Utah. Larry kind of took us under his wing, and we kind of had Rising Suns and Elf going at the same time for a while. And Larry put a red phone on my desk down in Nashville. He said, "I want to always be able to get in touch with you." He took pride in that, and if we sent him something that he really liked, he'd call and say, "Man, I love this record." He was a fun guy to work with. He was really a true record man. The only problem we had was the R&B records. The payola scare came along, and Bell was afraid to get in the middle of that. So back then, you just had to figure out a way to pay the jocks on the R&B side to ever have a hit. But we had a couple of other records on with Robert in England on the Monument label, Better Get Ready for Love, which was written by myself and Skip Rogers, who was a writer for me. And Somebody's Baby was on the B-side, which was actually, I believe, the B-side of Everlasting Love originally.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, Somebody's Baby it was.
But going back to Elf, there was quite a bit of material coming out on Elf. Some Clifford Curry, Bobby Russell, you put some out on him. Billy Swan, I believe, did a 45 on Elf too.
He did one on Rising Suns first called Friendship, and I can't recall what he did on Elf. But we had, of course, our big hit on Elf was Bobby Russell's 1432 Franklin Pike Circle Hero, which was kind of a Roger Miller type sounding thing, and that hit pretty well to like a top 20 record with Bobby. And it wasn't long after that we broke up our partnership. He moved to California, and then I moved around here in 1970 to Creative Workshop. So
yeah, was the Bobby Russell album the only album Elf put out? Because it was mainly 45s, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was the only album called Words, Music, Laughter, and Tears was the name of the album. I picked up a Jimmy Buffett 45 from those early days off of Barnaby, and we had a song called LSD, ELLISDEE. I noticed on the label it came out "He Ain't Free," which that was the hook of the song, LSD, He Ain't Free. It was kind of a anti-drug, anti-LSD song, if you can believe that. It came out on Barnaby, and the B-side was There's Nothing Soft About Hard Times, which is one of my favorite old Jimmy Buffett songs. And wasn't long after that Larry Rogers was running Mega Records. Larry, who had Studio 19 for years, and he still has Studio 19 out at the Sound Kitchen here in 2018. He picked up a song of mine called "Turning Your Back on Me," which was kind of a rocker. It was a pretty good song. And on the backside was a song called "Bilpy," which was a term for a hillbilly groupie, Bilpy. And those were just a couple of the oddball records.
There's another 45 I want to mention here that you put out, and that became a hit in Australia, and that was a song called "Adam and Eve." How did that fit into the whole?
That's right. I that was during my Billy Joe Royal phase. I was kind of imitating him on the vocal, and that's the only place it hit was in Australia, and it was a top 10 record. Went number one in Adelaide and a couple of other territories. I just recently did a interview with a radio station there, and they had all the information on all the songs that we'd had out in Australia, including Groupie and Hayride and Lala, which were 3 bubblegum records that Mac Gaden and I produced under different names that got covered by known groups over there, the Flying Circus and a couple of others.
Wasn't Haystack one of those too?
Hayride.
Hayride.
Yeah, Hayride was one that was that might have been the first Saturday morning cartoon show. That was the name of the fictitious group that we did that under, and that was quite a hit, I think, for the Flying Circus. And trying to think what else was a hit over there. Mac and I, we just liked to be in the studio, and we would cut something that turned us on that came to mind, and we'd go in and record it.
So before you had Creative Workshop, would you mainly work at Spar, or where were some of the recording studios recorded?
Worked at Fred Foster's studio down on 7th Avenue downtown, quite almost exclusively.
Okay.
Down there, yeah. We didn't do much other than the sound-alike records at Spar. We would work occasionally at Woodland and occasionally at Sound Shop, which no longer exists.
Yeah, but you just mentioned the sound-alike records, and I think some of the... Didn't you meet Travis Turk in that environment?
Yes, that's where I met Travis, was in that basement studio at the Baker Building here, close to Vanderbilt University in Nashville, and Travis and I became good friends, and then I coaxed him into coming out here and starting Creative Workshop with me, and so he played an important part in the building of this studio.
And was Jimmy Buffett, was he on a few things over there too, or is that a myth?
No, at Spar.
Some of those sound alike.
No, he wasn't on any of them. No, the reason that rumor got around was they took a picture out at the airport of a bunch of singers next to the a jet airplane out there, and they called it the Now Generation, and they needed a bunch of people to be in the picture, and Buffett was hanging around, and he went out there with us and got in the picture, so they mistakenly people thought he was on the record. On that, it was a compilation of a bunch of covers.
Yeah,
bunch of the sound-alike records.
And I know you're not necessarily as fond of that stuff, but that catalog has kind of discovered its own underground following. I know quite a few people here around Nashville who worship those sound-alike records.
Yeah, they were pretty bad, to tell you the truth. I mean, they, in retrospect, they were as good as we could get them, under the circumstances of having to rush through them and not have the best studio in the world. We had real good musicians.
Yeah.
And,
they did something similar in England too. Elton John ended up singing a lot of those before he had a career as an artist.
I'll be, yeah.
Hey, there was another 45 that came out on Warner Brothers for you. Where Was Love? And the B-side was Endless Circle. Do you remember that?
Yes, that was a fairly decent record, and I believe Dick Glasser became involved. I think he was still with Warner Brothers then when he put that out. I believe I finished the record. I don't know whether we did some overdubs in California on it or not, but I think I did the original record here, at least the original tracks. And so I can say I was on Warner Brothers for a brief period of time.
Yeah. And there was another single called Places that you wrote with Dan Penn.
That's right. Yeah, that was on Janus Records. And Steve, well, I can't think of his last name. I'm bad on last names today. A friend of mine had been a DJ down in South Carolina, and he got in the record business and got involved with Janus, and he picked that record up from us. I was always kind of proud of that. It was kind of a cool sounding little record.
Yeah, and that was one of your early collaborations with Dan. Although I know you met him in the, I guess, very early 60s.
Yes, that was one of the first ones we wrote. And then come up to into the 70s, we wrote Another Woman for T.J. Shepherd, which was a pretty big country hit for us. And then we had a Jerry Lee Lewis cover called You're All Too Ugly Tonight, which is a zany kind of a thing. I was talking to Jerry Kennedy about that the other day. Bobby and I wrote one for La Costa, who was Tanya Tucker's sister. She actually was on Capitol Records, and it was produced by Doug Gilmore, who was a friend of Bobby's, and it's called Jesse and the Light, written kind of a mystical kind of a thing, Louisiana sounding thing. And then also along that time, R.W. Blackwood, who was part of the Blackwood brothers family, recorded one that me and Austin Roberts had written called Dolly. And it was the story of Dolly, and it was on Scorpion Records, whatever that was. And then Austin and I, along with Charlie Black, wrote Timeless and True Love.
Yeah, that was a big hit for the McCarters.
Yeah, the McCarters on Warner Brothers. And then we had another cut with them, too. Quiet Desperation was an album cut on that album.
And then there was this, I guess, band of expats in Germany. They were called The Lords, and they recorded one of your songs, The Good Side of June.
Yeah, that's right. And what were they
Well, they were, I think, I don't know if they were, I think either British or Americans who ended up in Germany. I don't know if they were soldiers. I believe they might have been American soldiers who just kind of all ended up there.
Yeah.
And started that band.
Yeah, that song did pretty well over there. We got royalties for years from that song in Germany. And The Good Side of June, I think I put it out. I may have put it out on Rising Suns originally myself. I don't know.
Okay. And I know we're like jumping back and forth here, but on Elf, you had Van and Titus too.
Yes, Mac and I wrote Cry Baby Cry for them, which it hit the bottom of the charts. It did a little R&B wise, but it was a tremendous record. And you can tell us about the recent cover over the last couple of years.
Yeah, Christine Allman and Dion did a cover about maybe 5 years ago of the song, and she, I guess, randomly, discovered the 45 somewhere, and she said, I just love this song, and she wanted to do her version of it.
And we were honored, Mac and I were honored that they covered our arrangement almost exactly, the voices and everything that we put on it, and it was cool. And later on, a couple of the hits that I wrote later on was Tommy Overstreet's And Don't Go Running. That was about, I think it was 72, I think. And then Mel Tillis's Million Old Goodbyes was written with Steve Gibb and Bobby Russell. And that was kind of a funny story because I'd wanted to get those two guys together to write. And so Bobby said, well, why don't we all three just write it? So we proceeded to go. There was a club out at the corner of Brentwood. Nothing was in Brentwood then. It was just the corner of Old Hickory Boulevard and Brentwood, and there was a combination motel with a restaurant, and kind of a cool restaurant, had good steaks and everything. So we went out there and proceeded to get. Well, they got pretty sloshed. I figured someone had to be a quarterback and stay straight. And I said, well, let's go try to write this song. After we'd talked for a couple hours, we came back down here at Creative, and Bobby said, okay, Gib, play me one of those beautiful melodies. And he wrote, da-da-da, da-da-da, just right off the bat. And that became the key melody to it. There's a plane out tonight, and I swear to you, I'm gonna take that flight. And it just fell together like magic, and Mel just loved it. It went top, I think 5 or 4 or something like that. And that was one of the inside stories to that. It was produced by Jimmy Bowen, and Mel had a couple of #1 records prior to that, and this record was tearing up the charts. And lo and behold, Bowen and Mel got in an argument, got in a fight over something, and he pulled the plug on the promotion and kept it out of #1. So, but anyway, we were very pleased to have that. And Mel sang it for years on his show. He would tell me about it. He said, "Man, I love that song. I'm still doing it." And
around the same time, you wrote quite a few songs for or with Freddie Weller too.
Yeah, we had limited success. We had Go for the Night. We had a Go for the Night album, and actually Freddie did a version of A Million Old Goodbyes along the way. Yeah, Freddie and I had a good time together. And I failed to mention a song written by Bobby Russell, which started our Russell Cason catalog. Before he wrote Honey and Little Green Apples, he wrote The Joker Went Wild by Brian Hyland, arranged by Leon Russell, produced by Snuff Garrett and Leon. It was our first hit for Rising Suns.
Yeah. Now, somebody else you had a long relationship with, going back, I think, to the late 50s, was Brenda Lee, when you backed her up with the Casuals. And then, I believe in 72, you actually ended up writing a song for her called The Waiting Game.
That's right. It was on the backside of Think, one of her big ballads. So we took a free ride on that. And Bob Beckham and I had another cut with Brenda later on, which the title is slipping my mind. But I had Bob became the premier publisher in Nashville, taking over Combine Music with Fred Foster, and he had a hit on Just As Much As Ever, which I don't know who the writer was on, but I'm pulling out a 45 here that came out in it would have been the late 60s, called Midnight, written by me and Bob, and Footprints, also written by Bob Beckham and I. And then we got a cover on one of ours, one that I wrote with Bob, called The Sound of a Broken Heart. We wrote those for Champion Music, which was the publishing wing of Decca Records. Bill Downer was the publishing guy. And also you probably recall the Fleetwoods.
Yeah.
Come Go With Me. Bobby and I had a record in the 60s called Ruby Red and Baby Blue by the Fleetwoods, produced by Dick Glasser. And so
you told me once that, and I believe that was when you were out in L.A., you had an encounter with Frank Zappa. What was that?
Yes, I would screen people off of the streets. When the secretary down front, we kind of had a thing going. I said, well, look, if they look halfway legitimate or look like they have a story or something interesting, send them up. So she said, I got one for you. She said, this guy's name is Frank Zappa from Cucamonga, California. I said, I got to meet this guy. So he comes up. He's got, just like the rest of us, we wore those not always mohair suit, but tight-fitting 60s type suits with pompadour hair, and he had his hair short with a pompadour. And he came up and had a batch of songs. And but the main thing he was talking about, he was just real open with me, and he was talking about having to go through a divorce and all this stuff. And so, not being much of a counselor, I said, well, what kind of songs do you have? And he gave me one. I remember the riff to it. It was going back again to see the one I left behind me when I went out to see this big old world. You know, he was big on writing riffs. He would play a whole set with just riffs, and we wound up recording that. I recorded it. Snuff produced it, and we recorded it with Ricky Page, who was a background singer. She had a tremendous voice, this girl had, but it never came out. And we recorded another one of his. So he always claimed that next to Art LeBeau at Oldies But Goodies, that I was the second person to ever listen to his songs and try to do something with them. And I went down to Houston one night, and I was on my way back to Nashville, and the flight got canceled, so I saw where he was playing, and I managed to get to the venue, and he called me out in the audience and told everybody that here's a guy back there that's the second guy that ever listened to my songs. And that was funny.
Yeah. And so earlier you mentioned like some of the band names you made up just on the spot to put out the 45. There was another one that came out on Elf, and that was the Saturday morning cartoon show.
Yes, that was the ones I was talking about that Mac and I did. We did Hayride, the original Hayride.
Yeah, and La La.
La La, yeah. And they were the ones that were covered in Australia quite successfully.
Who was in there? Was it mainly Mac and you?
Yeah, it was just me and Mac and some musicians. Probably Kenny Butcher on drums and no telling who on bass and keyboards. But we did those probably with Brent Mayer up at Fred Foster Studio, I would imagine.
Yeah. And then we mentioned that you collaborate with Jimmy Buffett, and you also recorded him, and some of the musicians that ended up on the Buffett records, they later became White Duck, and they did a couple albums here too, didn't they? And John Hyatt was part of one of them.
Yes. I talked to the guys and said, let's make a record, and by then Jimmy had kind of moved on. He never used them on the road. They did backed him here in Nashville at the old Nashville Music Festival, which Joe Sullivan and I started back in 1970, and maybe I played a couple of things with him, but he couldn't afford to carry anybody on the road. He couldn't afford to pay them, so they. A couple of the guys, Mario Friedel and Don Klutsky, were very good writers, real creative guys. And I said, let's put some stuff down. So we put it down here in the that would have been the old room, the old configuration of Creative Workshop. And I got in touch with Russ Reagan, and he put the stuff out, and we unfortunately got kind of shafted by a manager. I can't think of this guy's name now, but he had little feet in the early days. I want to say it was Rick Smith. I can't recall, but it was on the album was on Uni Records, which was a subsidiary of Universal, MCA. And Russ Reagan ran it, and it was really a cool record. And we were all geared up to go on tour, and Russ had already granted tour support, but the manager didn't come through with the dates. He didn't come through with the tour, so we were screwed. So, but in the meantime, we did well enough with that record to merit doing another second record. And when we did, the guys had started hanging out with John Hyatt, who was 17 at the time. And John got in the group and sings on the second record. I think it's called In Season. He sings a couple of solos.
Yeah,
on that.
You got a writing credit on a song called Bull Island Boogie.
Yeah, Bull Island was a huge festival that took place up in Indiana. It had a larger turnout than Woodstock. It was, I I don't know, had 150,000 people or something. It was crazy, and we wrote a song about that experience. I remember we didn't go on. I say we because I was up there with White Duck. Didn't go on till about 4 to 5 in the morning. Everybody was just all passed out, but it was quite the experience.
Yeah, we just listened to an interview with Jimmy Buffett where he was talking about that second album he did, the High Cumberland Jubilee album, where it was like concept records were like the thing to do, I guess, at that time. There was another concept record you were involved with, and that was Fox, the Revolt of Emily Young.
The Revolt of Emily Young. Yeah, we were kind of ahead of our time because we did that before anybody ever did it. We called it a rock novella. We recorded out at Wayne Moss studio out at Cinderella, and Pepper Martin and I wrote most everything on it. And it was on Decca, but Decca was just cold as ice then. Decca couldn't promote a rock band at all. It was before The Who and all the other acts that came along later. But it was a good record. You know, it was it had its high points.
Yeah, and then I guess up through the mid-'70s, you put out 45s under your own name and some of those various other names, but then you made an album for Dick James Music. How did that record come about?
Yeah, for DJM, well, I was friends with Arthur Braun. He would come visit. I don't know what his role was. He was kind of represented the record company and the publishing, and he would come to see me, and I'd play him some demos, and he'd say, "You need to make a record." I said, "Oh man, I'm well past that," and that would have been, you may know better than me, I think it was 1980, I believe, when we made that record.
Yeah, I think it was 77.
Yeah, and so okay, and we had a good bunch of guys on it. Had Jerry Carrigan, Randy Goodrum on keyboard, Steve Gibson on guitar, probably Jack Williams on bass, and kind of a similar thing happened. We had it lined up, and I don't know who the agent was, but Mo West was involved. Dottie West's son, who was a tremendous musician, was involved in the band version of. I don't know whether he played on the sessions or not, but he was willing to go on the road with me, and we did a showcase for a guy from New York, Carmen. I can't think of his last name, and Arthur Braun. We did a showcase at a club over here, and they really liked it. They said, "Well, come to New York, meet with Stephen James, who was Dick James' son." And I remember Robbie Robertson, was kind of acting like a manager for me. We flew up to New York and laid out our plans to tour, and we had an all-star band and everything. And Stephen James just shot us down. Just said, "No, we can't do that. We don't have the budget for that." And we were just stuck, with a nice album and nowhere to go, So, because in those days you had to have tour support to carry around a band and not get paid very much for the gigs, So, but
it was a good album. It was very reminiscent of somebody like Elton John, or sounded very British to me for some reason.
Yeah, it kind of has that flavor. It sure does. Yeah, it's got some pretty decent songs on it. I wrote a lot of them, and then there were some that were written by outside folks. But
and then a couple of years later, you did another album on your own Berry Hill label.
Yeah.
Caught Up in a Dream.
Caught Up in a Dream, that's right, yeah. the cover was the best thing about that. I went out here on Nolensville Road and crawled up on. I had a white suit and a white hat, and crawled up on a load of watermelons. It was kind of a southern themed. I just pulled out a 45 over here of "So Fine," the old Fiestas song that we covered on that record. But most of them were original on it. Most of the songs were.
Yeah. And was it around the same time that you got to collaborate with Glenn Campbell?
Well, it's kind of an odd story. In '77, Arthur arranged for us, me and him, to go to Tokyo on the Tokyo Music Festival. So we needed a song, and we needed kind of a pop type song. But Glenn Campbell had sent this idea to Bobby, called "Everybody Loves Me But You," and Bobby said, "You want to write this thing, finish it?" And I said, "Yes." So we finished it, and I submitted it to Arthur. He said, "That's the one you need to be doing." And of course, they capitalized over there in Japan on Glenn Campbell wrote this song with Buzz Cason and Bobby Russer, and so that was the. I never saw Glenn. I knew Glenn from the '60s, from sessions in California, and had seen him several times. But we did that song, had a nice arrangement on it and everything, and we didn't win the festival, but we had a big time.
Yeah, and then in the mid '80s, you, I think sound-wise, you almost went back to the beginning a little bit and cut what I would consider almost a rockabilly album with BC and the Darts, American Saturday Night.
Yeah, that was in '86. We really had a good time doing that. We had, on the original one, we had Vip Vipperman on guitar and Richard Carpenter on drums, and Glenn, the big bass player, Glenn
Worf?
Glenn Worf, yeah, Glenn Worf on bass, and that was the original BC and the Darts album, and we played around
Dickie
town.
Betts played on that record too.
He played on the second record. Well, no, I guess he did play on that.
How did that come about? Do you remember that?
He was in town doing something and cutting a session. I said, "You want to play on this thing?" He said, "Sure." He needed the money, evidently. So he played on it, and then we did a second one called Rhythm Bound, which didn't come out till like the late '90s or something on SPV Records out of Germany. They put both of the records out on a compilation, kind of an album, a double CD. But we had a lot of fun doing that, doing the rockabilly thing. We did it as authentic as we could, with not spoofing rockabilly, but trying to cut like you would cut them back in those days, slap back and simple arrangements and everything, real driving beat.
Yeah, and then the next album was a Soldier of Love album, which kind of connected that rockabilly phase with your Americana phase, if I may call it that.
You mean with the Derailers, the Soldiers of Love?
No, your Soldier of Love album. The East of Nashville album.
East of
Nashville.
East of Nashville. Yeah, East of Nashville never really came out. It was done. That was going to be the title of my book. It was going to be called East of Nashville, Living the Rock and Roll Dream. And then the publishers, Hal Leonard, dropped the East of Nashville part. And subsequently, I kind of dropped the ball on the album. But it had mostly original songs on it. And then, well, in the late '90s, the Derailers cut an album and called it Soldiers of Love and showed them on the front cover with a bunch of military gear and everything. Brian Hofelt was a big Beatles fan, and he had heard that I wrote that Beatles song, and he was real interested in meeting me. We met down at the Texas Music Festival at Larry Joe Taylor's, and I invited him to come up here and record, so that's how that got started. And we wrote some songs for that together. And that led to me beginning my so-called Americana career with Hats Off to Hank album along about 2000. And it's been, I don't know how many albums later, 8 or 9. But
Around the, I guess that might have been the early to mid 90s too, you started a collaboration with Anthony Crawford. How did you meet Anthony?
Yeah. Actually, it was a golfing friend of mine. Anthony was a golf nut like me. The only difference in us is he can play and I can't. He's good and I'm lousy. But Stan Smoot, a teacher and a golf teacher and a kind of little entrepreneur, he had told me before about Anthony. He said, "Yeah, I got to hook y'all up. Y'all ought to really hit it off." Now, I had heard Anthony sing in this studio one time, but I asked somebody, "Who is that?" And they said, "It's Anthony Crawford." But I didn't get to meet him. And I later on saw him down at the old fanfare at the racetrack, Fairground Speedway, playing with Dwight Yoakam. But Stan said, "Come out." I went out to take a lesson, and I always tell everybody I met Anthony in a sand trap because I was taking a lesson on how to get out of a sand trap. And he said, hey, I want you to meet this guy. This is Anthony Crawford. So we made touch base and started recording in a tool shed out at his house in Gladeville, Tennessee, out east of town here. And we recorded the Radio Cafe album out there. And we wrote several songs. In fact, Destiny, which is a song off of that album, and How Do You Know are coming out on the next Sugarcane Jane album, which is coming up later on this year.
And Sugarcane Jane is Anthony and his wife.
Yeah,
Savannah.
that's right. Yeah, he later on, he went through a divorce and moved back, went through a couple of divorces, and wound up back in Alabama and he had met Savannah before, and she went through a divorce and moved back down there. And they got together and started playing together under the name Sugarcane Jane. And we made a record together called Dirt Road's End. And that made quite a bit of noise in the Americana field. And we've written some good songs together, Anthony and I have. And we've written several for this new project that's coming up, too.
Yeah, so you that's another long-term relationship there.
Yeah.
And I know that's not the only one you got cooking at the moment. So you've been quite busy recently, working with different artists, and also working on a documentary about the Creative Workshop Studio and the music scene that evolved from it here in Berry Hill. And in that documentary, which will come out before too long, there's a theme song that you wrote called Ballad of Berry Hill, where it kind of talks about you starting the studio. How much is, having the studio, how much have you benefited from having that at your disposal whenever you needed to be creative?
Well, it's been a real asset, I think, because it's there for you, and when you get an idea that you're hot on, it's good to go in and try to put it down while you're enthused about it. And it was always a dream of, the original dream of Bobby Russell and I, and then he pulled out of the studio business, but I always wanted it for, I didn't really intend to go into the competitive studio business, but we built such a good place and a good sounding room that people wanted to use it, so we rented it out to them, and in the meantime, my production stuff got kind of pushed off to the side because I couldn't get in the room, it was so busy. But been able to come in here with, originally Travis Turk was the engineer, and then Brent Mayer came back in 1976, and we did the restoration and the improvements, and he was here for quite a few years, and then we built Creative 2 next door, which is now Blackbird, and we were always looking for something new, something fresh to come in and record, so it's been good. It's been real exhilarating, and we have just finished the documentary, and it tells a story. It's called Berry Hill from Creative Workshop and Beyond, and we also visit other studios in the documentary, kind of telling the story about how people came out here and kind of followed us out in 1970 and started coming out, and now there's 40 studios in a 1 square mile area. So it's been pretty exciting.
Yeah, and I know that everybody here in Berry Hill, is real. It's a real community, and somebody in the documentary said, "Well, I don't know who the mayor of Berry Hill is, but if you ask me, Buzz Cason is the musical mayor of Berry Hill."
Yeah, that was probably John McBride next door, who now, of course, owns Blackbird. Yeah, I think I interjected in there. I said, "Well, actually, the king," because Steve Gibson always called me, "Hey, King, King of Berry Hill." Oh man,
Yeah.
Trouble is I don't get paid for the job.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for spending this past hour with me going down memory lane. I know that you're always more interested in worrying about what's ahead than what's behind you, so I really appreciate you doing this here for an hour.
Yes, Andreas, and all the best with your show, the Crazy Chester Radio Hour, and it's great being here with you, and anytime you want to do it again, we'll do it.
All right. I'm sure we can find a time.
Hi to everyone out there. If you want to contact me, it's buzzcason.com.
That's true, and the studio is creativeworkshoprecording.com. All right. Well, thanks for being my guest today.
Thank you.
This is the 26th episode of the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. We taped it at Buzz Cason's Creative Workshop recording studio in the Berry Hill neighborhood of Nashville. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Until next week.